In the still of the night, when shadows meld into the corners of the room and the world outside falls silent, there lies a fear that grips the heart of Evelyn. It wasn't always like this. Sleep once came easily, a blissful escape from the toils of the day. But that was before the dreams began, before the line between waking and sleeping blurred into a nightmare from which she could not awaken. Each night, as she lay in bed, the fear would creep in, a silent specter looming over her. It whispered of the horrors that awaited in sleep, of a dream world that had turned against her, where the laws of physics and logic no longer applied, and where she was hunted by something unseen. The dreams always started the same way. Evelyn, alone in an endless field of withered grass, under a sky blackened by roiling clouds. No matter how far she ran, the horizon never drew closer, the feeling of being pursued growing with each desperate step. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the very atmosphere sought to crush her. And then it would appear, a shadow among shadows, its form shifting, never fully revealed. Its presence was a void that pulled at her, a darkness that sought to consume her essence. She could feel its desire, not just to harm, but to obliterate, to erase her very being from existence. Each night, Evelyn would wake screaming, the remnants of the dream clinging to her like cobwebs, the fear of sleep growing stronger. She tried everything to ward off the dreams, meditation, medication, even old wives' tales and charms, but nothing worked. The entity in her dreams seemed to feed on her fear, growing stronger, its pursuit more relentless. Exhaustion became her constant companion, her eyes haunted by the knowledge of what awaited her in the darkness of sleep. Friends and family grew concerned, but how could she explain the inescapable terror that lived in her dreams? How could she tell them that she was afraid to sleep, that to close her eyes was to invite annihilation? The breaking point came on a night like any other, the clock ticking away the hours as she lay awake, the dread building. In a moment of desperation, Evelyn decided to confront her fear, to stay awake and face whatever came. She would not sleep, could not, for to do so was to surrender. But the human body has its limits, and despite her efforts, sleep claimed her, dragging her into the dark depths where it waited. This time, however, something was different. She found herself in the field again, but she was not alone. Others were there, each one a prisoner of their own fear, hunted by their shadows. It was then that Evelyn understood. The entity was not just a figment of her nightmares. It was a collector of fears, feeding on the terror of those it ensnared in its dream world. And she, like the others, was trapped, a part of its twisted collection. As the shadow closed in, its form clearer now, a twisted mirror of her own fears, Evelyn realized the futility of her struggle. There was no escape from this place, no waking from this nightmare. Her scream, when it came, was one of despair, a sound that echoed in the dreams of the others, a final testament to her fate. In the real world, Evelyn's body was found peaceful in her bed, as if she had simply slipped away in her sleep. But those who knew her, who saw the haunted look that had lived in her eyes, understood that her end was not peaceful. She had been consumed by her fear, a prisoner in a dream from which there was no awakening. And in the quiet of the night, when the shadows grow bold, and the world falls silent, there are those who lie awake, afraid to sleep, for fear of the field in the shadow that waits in the darkness, ever hungry for the terror that sleep brings. The small town of Gallows End had always been a quiet place, where everyone knew everyone else, and the most exciting event was the annual fall fair. So, when the local high school announced the arrival of a new teacher, Mr. Alcott, it was the talk of the town. Young, charismatic, and with a passion for literature that was infectious, Mr. Alcott quickly became a favorite among students and faculty alike. But with Mr. Alcott's arrival, a palpable change swept through the school. It began subtly. Students who once struggled in class were now excelling, especially in Mr. Alcott's literature course. They were enthralled by his lectures, hanging on his every word as if under a spell. Parents and teachers marveled at the transformation, attributing it to Mr. Alcott's innovative teaching methods and the personal interest he took in his students. Lucy, a shy student with a love for the written word, was particularly taken with Mr. Alcott. He encouraged her writing, praising her creativity and offering to tutor her after school to hone her skills. Eager to improve and flattered by the attention, Lucy accepted. The after-school sessions were intense, Mr. Alcott pushing Lucy to explore the darkest corners of her imagination, to write stories that delved into themes of fear, loss, and the macabre. Under his guidance, her writing flourished, but it also took on a disturbing quality, her stories filled with characters and events that mirrored the shadows lurking in the corners of her mind. As weeks turned into months, a series of unsettling incidents began to occur within the school. Students reported nightmares so vivid they were afraid to sleep, their dreams invaded by the characters and scenes from Lucy's stories, stories that Mr. Alcott had helped her shape. Whispers of books flying off shelves in the library and strange, inhuman shadows stalking the halls at night unsettled the student body. The climax came one stormy night when Lucy vanished. A search of the school led to Mr. Alcott's classroom, where they found her latest story laid out on the desk, its pages filled with tales of a world beyond the veil, a realm where the written word held the power to alter reality. The final entry spoke of a girl who, seeking to escape the mundanity of her life, wrote herself into her story, never to return. In the days that followed, Mr. Alcott too disappeared, leaving behind a school shrouded in whispers and fear. The once vibrant hallways felt oppressive, as if a weight had settled over the building, a reminder of the price of venturing too far into the darkness of one's imagination. Lucy was never found, her story becoming a cautionary tale whispered among students. Mr. Alcott's name was seldom spoken, his legacy a shadow that hung over the school, a presence felt but never seen. The students he had taught moved on, their memories of that year fading like mist in the morning sun, but the change he had wrought remained, a dark undercurrent in the life of the school. And in the quiet of the night, when the storm winds howl and the world outside seems a distant memory, the pages of Lucy's final story turn of their own accord, the words glowing faintly in the darkness, a portal to a place where stories are too real, and the cost of creation is a life itself. The incessant creaking of the old house had always been a source of comfort for Emily, a reminder of the home's enduring presence through generations. However, one chilling autumn night, that comfort was shattered by a sound that would forever haunt her, the sound of someone, or something, trying to open her bedroom door. It began as a subtle scratching, like the tentative fingers of a leaf against the window pane, but as the night deepened, so too did the intensity of the sound. It transformed into a deliberate, rhythmic tapping, then a persistent turning of the doorknob, each attempt more forceful than the last. Frozen in fear, Emily lay in her bed, the covers drawn tight as her eyes fixated on the door. The moonlight spilled through the curtains, casting long, sinister shadows across the floor, the light seeming to hesitate at the threshold of her door, as if afraid of what lay beyond. The house was empty, her parents away on a trip, leaving Emily to question whether her mind was playing tricks on her. Perhaps the wind, or the house settling, she reasoned, despite knowing the night was still and the door's attempts too deliberate. Gathering her courage, Emily called out, her voice a shaky whisper in the oppressive silence of the room. "Who's there?" There was no answer, only a brief cessation of the sounds before they resumed, more insistent than before. The realization that whatever sought entry was not deterred by her presence filled Emily with a terror so profound it rooted her to the spot. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly, the sounds at the door an unyielding torment. As dawn approached, the attempt ceased, leaving Emily to wonder if the light of day had driven away the presence. Exhausted and unnerved, she finally succumbed to a fitful sleep, the events of the night a tangled nightmare in her mind. The following night, the attempts resumed, more desperate than before. It was then that Emily noticed it, the door slightly ajar, the lock undone. Panic seized her as the reality set in. The door had been unlocked from the inside. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and fearful days. Emily was a prisoner in her own room, the door a boundary that held back an unknown horror. Friends and family grew concerned at her haggard appearance and tales of the door, attributing it to stress or an overactive imagination. But Emily knew the truth. Something unseen and unknowable sought her, its intentions obscured by the barrier of the door. In desperation, she installed locks, barricades, anything to strengthen the door's defense, but each night the sounds returned, the attempts growing more violent, as if enraged by the obstacles. Then came the night when the barricades held no more. The door burst open with a force that sent Emily scrambling to the farthest corner of her room. There, in the doorway, stood a figure shrouded in shadows, its form indistinct, a darkness that seemed to absorb the light around it. Its presence filled the room, a suffocating pressure that left Emily gasping for air, her heart racing in terror. The figure advanced, and with each step, the temperature dropped, the shadows deepening until light was but a memory. As it reached her, Emily realized the horrifying truth. The entity had always been with her, a silent watcher waiting for the moment to reveal itself. It was not the door that had kept it at bay, but its own choosing, and now it no longer wished to wait. Her screams went unheard, the darkness swallowing the sound as it had swallowed the light. When the dawn broke, Emily's room was empty, the door ajar, an invitation to an unknown fate. The mystery of her disappearance lingered, a dark stain on the memory of the old house. Whispers of shadows and doors left ajar became a cautionary tale, a warning of the unseen horrors that lurked just beyond the threshold, waiting for the moment to cross over. Adrift in the heart of the ocean, where the horizon melds seamlessly with the sky, there was a man named Thomas. Once a sailor of formidable repute, he found himself alone on a lifeboat, the sole survivor of a merciless storm that had claimed his ship and crew. The sea, a vast expanse of unforgiving blue, stretched endlessly in every direction, a mirror to his isolation. Days blurred into nights, each indistinguishable from the last, save for the relentless sun that scorched by day and the cold, indifferent stars that watched by night. His supplies dwindled, water and food becoming luxuries he could scarcely afford. Desperation clawed at his mind, whispering promises of surrender to the depths below. It was on the brink of despair that Thomas first heard it, a voice, soft and melodic, rising from the waves. At first, he believed it to be the product of his loneliness, a hallucination born of thirst and hunger. But the voice persisted, growing louder with each passing day, its words unintelligible yet somehow comforting. Compelled by a longing he could not explain, Thomas found himself drawn to the voice, spending hours peering into the ocean's depths, searching for its source. The sea, once his adversary, now held a mesmerizing allure, the promise of an answer to his solitude. One night, under a moon so bright it turned the sea to silver, he saw her, a figure in the water, her form blurred and shifting, the origin of the voice that had become his only solace. She called to him, her words clear now, inviting him to join her in the depths, promising an end to his isolation, a belonging he had longed for since the storm. Entranced, Thomas leaned over the edge of the lifeboat, his hand outstretched towards the figure. As their fingers touched, the sea around him came alive, a whirlpool of light and shadow, pulling him from the boat and into the water. The cold shock of the ocean's embrace was a stark awakening. Panic set in as he fought against the pull of the depths, the promise of belonging now a terrifying reality as he realized the figure's true nature. She was not a savior, but a siren of the deep, one of many that preyed on the lonely souls of sailors, their voices a lure to the watery grave that awaited below. Thomas struggled, but the siren's grip was unyielding, her strength otherworldly. As he was dragged deeper, the light of the moon faded, replaced by the darkness of the ocean's heart. The pressure mounted, a physical weight that threatened to crush him, his lungs burning for air that would not come. In his final moments, Thomas understood the cruel irony of his fate. In seeking an end to his solitude, he had embraced a demise far more isolating than the lifeboat adrift in the endless sea. His last breath was a silent plea, lost in the cold embrace of the ocean. When the search parties found the remnants of his ship, there was no sign of Thomas or the lifeboat. He became another tale among sailors, a whispered warning of the voices that call in the night, of the siren's song that promises an end to loneliness, leading only to the eternal solitude of the deep. And in the heart of the ocean, the sirens continue their song, their voices a melody of longing and despair, waiting for the next soul to call to them, to surrender to the depths below.
The sensation of cold stone against my skin jolted me awake, a stark contrast to the warm comfort of my bed I expected. Confusion clouded my mind as my eyes, heavy with sleep, struggled to adjust to the darkness that enveloped me. This wasn't my room. The air was damp and carried a musty scent, the kind that whispered of long-forgotten places hidden away from the light of day. I tried to stand, my movements hesitant, as my hands searched the ground for anything that might tell me where I was. The floor was rough, uneven stone, and as my fingers traced the contours of the ground, they brushed against something cold, metallic, a chain. Panic surged through me as I followed the chain with my hands, only to find it shackled to my ankle, the other end disappearing into the darkness beyond my reach. The realization that I was imprisoned, tethered like an animal, ignited a primal fear within me. How did I get here? Where was here? My last memory was of climbing into bed, the comforting silence of my room lulling me into sleep. Now I found myself in a nightmare from which I could not wake. My heart raced as I called out into the darkness, my voice echoing off unseen walls, answered only by the oppressive silence of my prison. I was alone, utterly and hopelessly alone, in a place that felt as ancient as time itself. Hours, or perhaps days, passed in the darkness. The concept of time lost all meaning in my subterranean cell. I slept fitfully, haunted by dreams of shadowy figures and the sound of something unseen moving in the darkness beyond my chain's reach. It was during one of these restless slumbers that the light came. Not the gentle, warming light of the sun, but a cold, bluish glow that seeped into the chamber like a living thing. It emanated from a figure that stood just beyond my chain's length, its form obscured by the light. The figure spoke, its voice a symphony of whispers that filled the chamber. It told of a world beneath the world, of a kingdom of shadows that existed in the spaces between breaths. It spoke of a choice: remain in the darkness, forgotten by the world above, or embrace the kingdom of shadows to become a part of the eternal night. Desperation and isolation had worn me down, the edges of my resolve frayed to breaking. The promise of escape, even into a world of shadows, was a siren's call I could not resist. I agreed, my voice a mere whisper, drowned out by the pounding of my heart. The figure moved closer, the light intensifying until it was all I could see. Then, with a touch as cold as the grave, it severed my chain, freeing me from my physical bonds. But as the light faded and my eyes adjusted to the darkness once more, I realized the true nature of my choice. I was no longer in the chamber, but nor was I free. The world around me was a blur of shadows and half-seen shapes, a realm that existed in the periphery of reality. I could see the world I knew, watch the lives of those I loved, but I could not touch, could not speak, could not return. I had become a shadow, bound to the kingdom of eternal night, my presence a cold whisper in the world of the living. And in my heart, a darkness grew, a void where hope had once lived. The chamber remained, a silent tomb for the person I once was, the chain lying broken on the cold stone floor. Above, the world moved on, unaware of the kingdom that lurked just beyond the veil of shadows, and of the souls that wandered its darkened paths, lost to the light forever. On a desolate stretch of road that cut through the heart of the wilderness, Sarah's car coughed a final, weary breath before coming to a complete stop. The dashboard lit up like a Christmas tree, warnings and indicators flashing their silent alarm. Outside, the twilight had deepened into an oppressive darkness, the dense forest on either side of the road swallowing any hope of light. Sarah tried the ignition again, desperation coloring her attempts, but the car remained silent, an inert mass of metal and memories in the middle of nowhere. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling slightly, only to find it dead, the battery drained during the long drive. Panic began to set in as the reality of her situation took hold. She was alone, miles from the nearest town, with no way to call for help. The forest seemed to press in on her, a living, breathing entity that watched and waited. The sounds of the night, the rustle of leaves, the distant howl of a wolf, filled the silence, a reminder of her vulnerability. With no other options, Sarah decided to leave the safety of her car in search of help. She remembered passing a gas station some miles back, a flicker of civilization in the vast wilderness. Wrapping her jacket tightly around her, she set off along the road, the beam of her flashlight a small island of light in the overwhelming darkness. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, the gas station a mirage that receded with every step she took. The sounds of the forest grew louder, more insistent, as if the night had come alive with unseen watchers. Sarah's heart raced, each shadow a potential threat, each noise a signal of pursuit. It was then she saw it, a light in the distance, not the welcoming glow of the gas station, but something colder, more sinister. Driven by a mix of fear and hope, Sarah followed the light off the road and into the forest, the underbrush grasping at her legs like hands, the trees whispering secrets she could not understand. The light led her to a clearing where an old, dilapidated house stood, its windows dark, the light she had seen coming from a lantern hung by the door. Relief washed over her as she approached, her mind filled with visions of a phone call to a tow truck, a warm bed while she waited for dawn. But as she reached the door, it swung open on its own, revealing a room shrouded in shadows, the lantern the only source of light. Hesitation gripped her, the instinctual knowledge that to enter was to cross a threshold from which there was no return. Yet the forest behind her offered no sanctuary, and with a breath to steel her nerves, Sarah stepped inside. The door slammed shut, the sound echoing in the silent house. The lantern flickered, casting dancing shadows across the walls, revealing glimpses of a life long abandoned. Furniture lay covered in dust, pictures hung askew on the walls, their faces scratched out, leaving only empty gazes. A sense of dread settled over Sarah as she realized the house was not empty. Figures moved in the periphery of her vision, whispers filled the air, a chorus of voices that spoke of tragedy and loss. The house, she understood, was a prison for those who had wandered off the road, lured by the lantern's light, each one now a part of its fabric, their souls bound to the decaying wood and stone. In the heart of the house, Sarah found a room where the lantern's light did not reach, a darkness so profound it seemed to swallow all hope. From the shadows, a figure emerged, its form blurred and shifting, a manifestation of the house's sorrow. It spoke in a voice that was both many and one, telling of a hunger that could not be sated, of a loneliness that sought to fill the void with the souls of the lost. Sarah tried to flee, but the house was no longer a structure of wood and stone, but a living entity that knew her every thought, her every fear. The doors were barred, the windows unbreakable, the forest outside a distant memory. Her screams echoed in the empty rooms, a final testament to her fate. The house on the edge of the wilderness consumed her, her spirit another whisper in the chorus, her body never found, her car a rusting relic on a road that few traveled. And the lantern still hangs by the door, a beacon in the darkness, waiting for the next weary traveler to stray from the path, to seek the light in the heart of the forest, where the house waits, ever hungry, ever alone. Nestled on the edge of a dense and sprawling forest, my home had always been a haven of solitude and peace. The woods, with their ancient trees and whispered secrets, were a constant companion through the seasons. Their beauty was undeniable, yet an unspoken agreement hung in the air. One does not venture into the heart of the forest at night. It was a rule I had lived by without question until the night the forest called my name. It began as a whisper, so faint I thought it nothing more than the wind's playful dance through the leaves. But as the nights drew on, the voice grew stronger, more insistent, its tone familiar yet impossible to place. Elijah, it called, a siren song that pulled at the very fibers of my being. Curiosity mixed with an inexplicable sense of longing drove me to the forest's edge under the cover of darkness. The voice seemed to beckon me deeper into the woods, guiding me through the underbrush with a sense of purpose I could not deny. The trees loomed overhead, their branches reaching out like hands, guiding, urging me forward. The deeper I ventured, the more disoriented I became. The forest around me seemed to shift, the path twisting and turning in ways that defied my understanding of the land I had known all my life. And still, the voice called, my name a chant that echoed off the trees, drawing me ever onward. It led me to a clearing, a space where the moonlight filtered through the canopy above, casting the forest in a ghostly silver glow. In the center of the clearing stood a figure, shrouded in shadow, its form blurred and indistinct. It was the source of the voice, of that I was certain. "Fear not," it spoke, its voice a melody that resonated with a deep ache within me, an ache I had not known existed. "You are home." Confusion warred with a burgeoning sense of belonging as I stepped closer, drawn to the figure as if by an unseen force. As I approached, the details of its form seemed to slip away, the shadow ever shifting, never solidifying into something I could comprehend. It was then that the forest around me fell silent, a stillness so profound it felt as if the world had ceased to breathe. The figure reached out, its hand passing through me like smoke, a coldness that gripped my heart with a dread I had never known. "You are one of us now," it whispered, the words a death knell to the life I had known, bound to the forest, to its heart, forevermore. I tried to flee, to tear myself away from the clearing, but the forest would not release me. The trees, my once silent guardians, now stood as jailers, their trunks an impenetrable wall that closed in around me. Days turned to nights and back again, time losing all meaning as I wandered the endless woods, always returning to the clearing, to the figure that waited with the patience of the ages. The voice that had once called my name now spoke in tongues I could not understand, a chorus of the lost and the damned that filled the forest with their lament. In the end, I understood the truth of my fate. I was not called to the forest by chance but by design, a piece returned to the board in a game as ancient as the woods themselves. My life, my existence, had been claimed, another voice added to the chorus, another shadow within the heart of the forest. And somewhere beyond the trees, my home stands empty, a silent testament to the one who walked into the woods and never returned. The forest calls still, its voice a lure for those who listen, a promise of belonging that leads only to eternal darkness within its embrace. Late at night, in a house too large for a solitary soul, lived Julian. An old family estate nestled on the outskirts of a forgotten town became his refuge from the world. The silence of the estate was a comfort, a respite from the chaos of the outside. However, one cold, windless night, that silence was shattered by a knock on his bedroom window. Initially, Julian convinced himself it was nothing, a branch perhaps, swayed by a breeze he could not feel. But the night was still, the trees outside his window motionless under the moon's gaze. The knock came again, deliberate and clear, a human sound in the depth of night's embrace. With a heart pounding against the cage of his ribs, Julian approached the window, the old wood of the floor groaning under his steps. Peering into the darkness, he saw nothing but his own reflection, pale and wide-eyed, staring back at him. Yet, as he turned away, the knocking resumed, more urgent than before. Driven by a mix of fear and an insatiable need for answers, Julian decided to confront the source of his disturbance. He waited, his eyes fixed on the window, and when the knock sounded again, he threw the window open with a swift motion. But there was nothing. No figure stood in the moonlight, no sign of life in the sprawling gardens that stretched into the night. Only the echo of the knock, lingering in the air as if amused by his search. Nights passed, and with each, the knocking grew more persistent, a nightly visitor whose presence was marked by sound alone. Julian's sleep became fragmented, haunted by dreams of shadowy figures tapping against the glass, their faces obscured, their intentions unknown. Desperation led him to research the history of his family estate, uncovering tales of tragedy and sorrow that clung to the land like a curse. Stories of ancestors who vanished without a trace, of loves lost and hearts broken beyond repair. It was then that Julian stumbled upon the tale of Eleanor, a distant relative whose lover had gone to war, promising to return for her. Each night, she would wait by the window, a candle her only companion, until one night, when the knock she had longed for finally came. But it was not her lover who returned, but the news of his death, delivered with a knock on her window. Heartbroken, Eleanor threw herself from the very window she had watched from, her spirit said to wander the estate, forever waiting for a lover who would never return. Armed with this knowledge, Julian understood the nature of his nightly visitor. It was Eleanor, her knocks a plea for acknowledgement, a desire to be remembered, to have her story known. Driven by a newfound resolve, Julian approached the window on the next moonlit night, and when the knock came, he spoke. He told Eleanor of the world that had moved on, of the wars that had ended, of the peace that had settled over the land. He spoke of her lover, of the bravery that had led him to fight, and of the love that, even in death, had not waned. For a moment, the night held its breath, the silence a heavy blanket around him. Then, from the darkness, a soft whisper, a thank you from lips long silenced by death. And with that, the knocking ceased, the estate falling into a silence deeper than before. But peace, it seemed, was a fleeting thing. In the nights that followed, a new sound echoed through the halls of the estate, the footsteps of someone unseen, wandering the corridors, seeking something or someone lost in the veils of time. Julian's nights became a torment of sounds, the house alive with the movements of its former inhabitants, each locked in their own tragedies. And so, the estate grew restless, a cage of memories and sorrow, its inhabitants bound to the land by their pain. Julian, once a seeker of solitude, found himself ensnared in the tales of the past, a keeper of stories for those who could not tell their own. In the end, it was not the knocking that haunted him, but the silence when it finally stopped, the estate a tomb of untold stories, and Julian, another soul lost to its depths, his own tale a whisper in the night, a knock on the window of a house too large for just one. I had always been drawn to the solitude of my remote cabin in the woods, far from the cacophony of the city. It was my sanctuary, a place where I could write and reflect in peace. One stormy night, as I sat by the fireplace, lost in thought and the rhythmic tapping of rain against the windows, there came a knock at my door. It was odd, unsettling even, for visitors were rare, especially on such a tempestuous night. Hesitantly, I approached the door, my heart beating in erratic rhythm. Peering through the peephole, I saw a woman standing on my doorstep, her clothes drenched, her hair plastered to her face by the rain. Something in her eyes, a desperate plea, compelled me to open the door. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice betraying a hint of my apprehension. She looked at me, her eyes piercing the dimly lit entryway, and said, "I've come to warn you about things yet to happen. You must listen to me if you wish to survive." Her words, though cryptic, sent a chill down my spine. Inviting her in, driven by a mix of curiosity and concern, I led her to the living room, where she took a seat by the fire. Her presence filled the room with an inexplicable tension, as if the storm outside had somehow seeped into my home. She began to speak, her voice low and urgent. She talked of events yet to unfold, of tragedies and turmoil that would shake the very foundations of my world. She spoke of fires that would rage, of storms that would devastate, and of shadows that would creep into the hearts of men. Her predictions were vivid, painted with the brush strokes of someone who had seen these horrors firsthand. I listened, a growing sense of unease knotting my stomach. How could she possibly know of these things? Was she a prophet, a madwoman, or something far worse? As the night waned, her final words were a warning. "Beware the Ides of March. For on that day, a darkness will descend upon this place, seeking that which you hold most dear. Only by fire can it be cleansed." With that, she stood, her eyes meeting mine one last time before she vanished into the stormy night, leaving no trace behind but the lingering echo of her warnings. Days turned into weeks, and her words became a distant, if unsettling, memory. I tried to dismiss them as the ramblings of a disturbed mind, yet a part of me couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom she had instilled. Then came the Ides of March, a day that dawned clear and bright, belying the darkness that awaited. As night fell, an unease gripped me, a sense of dread I couldn't explain. It was then that it happened. A shadow, darker than the night itself, crept into my cabin, its form amorphous, its presence a cold void that sucked the warmth from the air. I remembered the woman's words, her warning. In a panic, I grabbed a lantern, the flame flickering to life in my trembling hands. The shadow recoiled from the light, its form writhing as if in pain. With a clarity born of desperation, I understood that fire was the key, the only way to banish the darkness she had foretold. The cabin, my sanctuary, became a pyre. The flames, once a source of warmth and light, turned into a raging inferno that consumed everything. I escaped into the night, the fire illuminating the woods around me, the shadow vanquished in its wake. But victory came at a cost. My home, my refuge, was reduced to ashes, and with it, the manuscript I had poured my soul into, the very thing I held most dear. I had survived, yes, but at what cost? The woman's warning had saved me, but in heeding it, I had lost everything. The woods, once a place of solitude and peace, now stood as a charred testament to the darkness that had descended upon my life, a darkness foretold by a stranger on a stormy night, a darkness that, despite my efforts, I had not been fully able to escape. In a dimly lit, sparsely furnished apartment on the edge of town, where the nights were longer and the fog clung to the streets like a shroud, there lived a man named Arthur. Arthur was a solitary figure, his life a routine of monotonous days blending one into the next, his only solace found in the quiet moments before the mirror in his bathroom each night. It started as a way to combat the loneliness, speaking his thoughts aloud to his reflection, as if conversing with an old friend. But as the days blurred into weeks and the weeks into months, the conversations took on a life of their own. Arthur's reflection began to respond. At first, it was subtle, a movement of the lips, a nod of the head, easily dismissed as a trick of the light or a figment of Arthur's imagination. But the responses grew more pronounced. The mirror, Arthur developing a voice that echoed in the small, tiled room, its timbre eerily similar to Arthur's own, yet tinged with an intangible difference that sent shivers down his spine. The mirror, Arthur spoke of secrets, of desires buried deep within Arthur's soul, of paths not taken and futures not realized. It whispered of the power that lay in letting go, in embracing the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface of Arthur's carefully constructed facade. Night after night, Arthur found himself drawn to the mirror, the conversations growing longer, more intense. The mirror Arthur began to change, its features sharpening, its eyes glowing with an unholy light. It spoke of a world beyond the mirror, a world where Arthur could find everything he ever desired if only he would step through. Arthur resisted, fear battling with the growing temptation. The life he knew was one of shadows and silence, but the mirror offered a promise of something more, a siren's call that grew harder to ignore with each passing night. The final conversation was a turning point. The mirror, Arthur's voice, was a commanding presence, filling the room with a palpable sense of urgency. It demanded that Arthur step through, to leave behind the shell of his existence and embrace a new reality. In return, it promised power, fulfillment, and an end to the crushing loneliness that had been Arthur's constant companion. Torn between fear and a desperate longing for something more, Arthur reached out, his fingers touching the cold glass of the mirror. In that moment, the barrier between worlds dissolved, the glass rippling like the surface of a still pond disturbed by a single stone. Arthur stepped through, the mirror closing behind him with a finality that brooked no return. He found himself in a world of shadows, where the air was thick with whispered promises and the laughter of unseen entities. The mirror Arthur was there, its form now twisted, a grotesque parody of Arthur's own, its eyes alight with malevolent glee. It was then that Arthur realized the truth. The mirror had been no gateway to fulfillment, but a trap, a prison for those seduced by the whispers of their darker selves. The world beyond the mirror was a realm of nightmares made real, a place of eternal darkness where hope died and despair reigned supreme. Back in the dimly lit apartment, the mirror remained, silent and watchful. And sometimes, if one listened closely, they could hear the faintest whispers, the sound of a man talking to himself, his voice filled with a longing that could never be satisfied, a warning left unheeded for the next lonely soul drawn to the mirror in search of answers. And Arthur? He was never seen again, his existence absorbed by the mirror, his voice just one more echo in the chorus of whispers, a cautionary tale of the dangers that lurk when one peers too deeply into the abyss and finds it staring back. The road to my cabin in the woods was one I had traveled many times before, a familiar journey that usually offered me a sense of solace, a break from the relentless pace of city life. The cabin itself was a rustic escape, a place where I could lose myself in the silence of the forest and the simplicity of nature. That night, however, as I navigated the winding roads through the dense thicket of trees under the cloak of darkness, a sense of unease settled over me, a premonition of something amiss. The storm that had been brewing on the horizon finally broke, rain pelting the windshield with such ferocity that it reduced my world to the mere few feet illuminated by the headlights. The roar of the engine and the battering of the rain drowned out all other sounds, creating a cocoon of isolation as I pressed on towards the refuge of the cabin. It was then, amidst the cacophony of the storm and the isolation of the road, that I heard it, a voice, soft and childlike, from the back seat of the car. "Are we there yet?" The words, so ordinary and yet so utterly impossible, sent a jolt of terror through me. I was alone, had always been alone on these trips to the cabin. Without daring to take my eyes off the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the gleam of eyes watching me from the darkness. But there was nothing, only the empty back seat filled with my belongings. The rational part of my mind scrambled for an explanation. A trick of the wind, perhaps, or the audio from a radio station caught in the storm's interference. But the voice had been so clear, so unmistakably real and human. "Are we there yet?" The voice came again, more insistent this time, a plaintive note of impatience threading through the words. Panic seized me, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, the familiar landmarks swallowed by the night and the rain. The isolation of the cabin, once my sanctuary, now felt like a trap, a place far removed from help or the comfort of human company. Driven by a need to escape the confines of the car and the voice that seemed to emanate from nowhere, I accelerated, the tires skidding on the wet asphalt. The trees blurred past, a dark wall that seemed to close in around me. Finally, the outline of the cabin appeared through the sheets of rain, its windows dark, the front door swaying gently in the wind, a sign that I had forgotten to secure it properly on my last visit. Relief washed over me, followed swiftly by a resurgence of fear. The door should have been locked, the windows shuttered against the storm. I parked the car and raced to the front door, my heart pounding in my chest. Inside, the cabin was as I had left it, the furniture shrouded in dust covers, the fireplace cold and unused. But the air felt different, charged with an unseen presence. "Are we there yet?" The voice, no longer behind me, but filling the space of the cabin, echoed off the walls, a chilling reminder that I was not alone. In that moment, a realization dawned on me with the clarity of a lightning strike. The voice, the presence in the car, it was not an intruder or a figment of my imagination. It was a memory, a fragment of the past I had tried to forget. The cabin, this place of solitude, had once been a haven for my family, for my little brother who had asked that very question on a night much like this, right before the accident that had taken him from us. The guilt I had buried, the grief I had run from, had found me again in the one place I had thought myself safe. The voice was his, a ghost of the past haunting the present, a reminder of the moment that had changed everything. I fled the cabin, the voice of my brother echoing in my ears, a lament for what had been lost. The storm raged on, indifferent to the tragedy of human lives, and the cabin stood silent in the woods, a tombstone marking the death of a family, the end of innocence, and the birth of a haunting that would follow me for the rest of my days, always asking, "Are we there yet?" In the heart of autumn, when the leaves had turned to fire and the air whispered of coming frost, a group of friends gathered in the abandoned house at the end of Willow Lane. It was a place shrouded in stories, of figures seen in windows long since boarded up, of whispers carried on the wind, untouched by the warmth of life for decades. They were drawn by the thrill of the unknown, the allure of communing with whatever spirits lingered in the decrepit halls. Among them was Lily, a skeptic who found amusement in the fears and superstitions of her friends. The idea of a Ouija board serving as a conduit to the dead was a quaint notion to her, a parlor trick at best. Yet, as the night drew on and the shadows within the house seemed to deepen, Even she could not deny the palpable sense of anticipation that filled the room where they sat, the Ouija board between them, a silent promise of secrets yet to be revealed. The flicker of candles cast their faces in a dance of light and darkness as they placed their hands on the planchette, their laughter fading into the stillness of the house. "Is anyone there?" they asked, a chorus of voices that broke the silence like the crack of a branch in the dead of night. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, slowly, the planchette moved, gliding across the board to rest upon yes. The laughter died on their lips, replaced by a sudden, gripping fear. "Who are you?" Lily asked, her voice a whisper against the weight of the silence that followed. The planchette moved again, spelling out a name none of them recognized, a name that would haunt them in the days to come: Ezekiel. The candles flickered as if caught in a sudden breeze, the temperature in the room dropping until their breaths became visible in the air. Questions poured forth, a desperate attempt to understand, to make sense of the presence they had contacted. But with each answer, the atmosphere grew heavier, the shadows in the corners of the room deepening, stretching. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the planchette stilled, and the room grew warmer, the candles steadying. They laughed then, a nervous, brittle sound, convincing themselves it had been a trick of the imagination, the power of suggestion. But as they left the house, a feeling of unease followed them, a shadow at their backs that whispered of eyes watching from the darkness. In the days that followed, strange occurrences began to plague them. Objects moved of their own accord, shadows flitted at the edge of vision, and whispers filled the night, words indiscernible but fraught with urgency. Each of them felt it, a creeping dread that tightened around their hearts like a vice. Lily, once a skeptic, found herself unable to deny the reality of what was happening. The name Ezekiel haunted her, appearing in places no one else had been, written in a hand that was not her own. She sought answers, delving into the history of the house and the land upon which it stood, discovering tales of a man named Ezekiel who had lived there in the early 1800s. A man whose life had ended in tragedy and whose spirit, it was said, lingered in bitter unrest. Determined to put an end to the terror that had taken over their lives, the friends returned to the house, to the room where they had unwittingly opened a door they could not close. They found the Ouija board as they had left it, the candles long since burned out, the darkness complete. With trembling hands, they repeated the ritual, calling out to Ezekiel, pleading for a release from the torment he had wrought. The planchette moved with a will of its own, spelling out a demand, a price for their freedom, a life for a life. The realization of what was asked of them, the horror of the choice before them, fractured the group, each turning on the other in fear and desperation. The house seemed to close in around them, the shadows alive with the malice of a wrathful spirit. In the chaos that ensued, a fire broke out, the flames consuming the room, the house, trapping them within. As the fire raged, Lily saw him, Ezekiel, standing amidst the flames, his eyes alight with a dark triumph. The fire department would later say it was a miracle anyone survived the blaze that took the abandoned house on Willow Lane. But for those who escaped, survival was a dubious gift. They were left with the scars of that night, both physical and mental, and the knowledge that they had stirred something ancient and wrathful from its slumber. Every house has its quirks, its creaks and groans, especially an old Victorian like the one I'd recently moved into. It had character, charm, and, as I soon discovered, secrets. The first few nights were uneventful, filled with the mundane tasks of unpacking and setting up my new life. But then the sounds began. It was a little past midnight when I first heard it, thumping from the basement, rhythmic and persistent. I told myself it was just the house settling, the old pipes, or perhaps some nocturnal animal that had made its way in. The rational part of my mind clung to these explanations, a lifeline in the growing sea of unease. The sounds continued, night after night, always starting at the same time, always the same sequence of thumps. Curiosity, mixed with a dose of newfound bravery, pushed me to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, I ventured down the creaking steps to the basement, the air growing colder with each descent. The basement was a relic of the past, filled with dust-covered boxes and forgotten furniture. I scanned the room with my flashlight, half expecting to find the source of the sounds, but there was nothing, only the echo of my own breathing and the thumping, now seemingly louder, more urgent. Frustration and fear melded together as I stood in the center of the basement, the sound enveloping me. That's when I noticed it, the floor. In a corner of the room, hidden beneath layers of dust and grime, was a trapdoor I hadn't seen before. The realization sent a chill down my spine. The thumping was coming from beneath that door, a call from the depths of the earth itself. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to seal the basement and never return, but the mystery was too deep, the need to know too compelling. I approached the trapdoor, the sound growing louder, more insistent. With trembling hands, I grasped the iron ring and pulled. The door resisted at first, as if it hadn't been opened in decades, but then it gave way, revealing a darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the beam of my flashlight. The thumping stopped, replaced by a silence that pressed against my ears. I peered into the abyss, the air rising from it cold and fetid like a breath from the grave. Then, without warning, the sounds resumed, not thumping now, but a scratching, a frantic scrabbling from the dark below. Panic seized me, a visceral, primal fear that rooted me to the spot. From the depths, something moved, a shadow within the shadows, formless yet imbued with a hunger that transcended physical need. The air grew colder, the darkness reaching up from the hole like tendrils seeking to pull me in. I stumbled back, my mind a whirlwind of terror and disbelief. The flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. I could feel it then, the presence from the hole, moving in the room with me, circling, drawing closer. I don't remember reaching the stairs or climbing them. I only remember the door to the basement slamming shut behind me, the sound echoing through the house like a final verdict. The nights that followed were a torment. The sounds from the basement continued, a constant reminder of the horror that lurked beneath my home. Sleep became an elusive, fleeting thing, chased away by the fear of what dwelled below. In the end, I left. The house, with its charm and secrets, was abandoned once more, left to stand as a silent sentinel in the night. But the sounds haunt me still. A ghostly symphony that follows me in the quiet moments before sleep. A reminder of the night I opened a door that should have remained closed, and of the things that dwell in the dark, waiting. Living in the heart of a bustling city has its perks, but privacy isn't one of them. My apartment, nestled in a worn but cozy building, offered a view of the alley and the windows of the building opposite. It was here that my ordeal began, a slow descent into paranoia and fear that would consume my very being. It started innocently enough. One night, as I prepared for bed, I noticed a figure in the window across the alley. My neighbor, a man I had seen but never spoken to, stood motionless, his gaze fixed on my room. I thought little of it at first, chalking it up to a coincidental glance. But night after night, I found him there, always watching, his presence a silent intrusion that began to fray the edges of my sanity. I drew the curtains, seeking to block him out, but the knowledge of his vigil kept me awake, my mind racing with questions about his motives. The nights grew longer, sleep more elusive, and every shadow in my room seemed to whisper of unseen eyes. The situation escalated when I started seeing him during the day, always at a distance, a shadow that haunted my steps. No matter where I went, I felt his gaze upon me, a weight that pressed down, suffocating me with fear. Confrontation seemed the only solution. Gathering my courage, I approached his apartment, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and desperation. But the man who answered the door was not the silent watcher I had expected. He was older, his eyes clouded with confusion, his hands trembling with the frailty of age. He knew nothing of the night spent at his window, his protest sincere and bewildered. Confusion took hold, a miasma that clouded my thoughts and judgment. If not him, then who? My mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. The police found nothing, their brief investigation turning up no evidence of wrongdoing. They left me with assurances and advice, but no answers. The eyes that watched me in the night remained, a specter that defied explanation. Isolation became my refuge, the outside world a stage for a performance I could no longer partake in. My apartment, once a sanctuary, became a prison, the windows a barrier that kept me caged with my fear. The final breaking point came without warning. Waking in the dead of night, I found the figure at his window, but he was not alone. Figures stood in the shadows behind him, their forms indistinct, their eyes alight with a hunger that chilled my soul. I screamed, a sound that tore from my throat with the force of my terror. The figures vanished, but the damage was done. My mind, pushed beyond its limits, fractured under the weight of my fear. When they found me, I was at my window, staring into the darkness, my eyes searching for the watchers who had vanished into the night. The hospital they took me to is clean and quiet, the windows barred, the rooms devoid of shadows. But still I watch and still I wait, for I know they are out there, in the dark, waiting to return. My sanity, a ship lost at sea, drifts further away with each passing day. The watchers took it with them, leaving me in this limbo of fear and madness. And as I gaze out at the world I can no longer be a part of, I wonder if they ever existed at all, or if they were merely the manifestation of a mind undone by isolation and dread. The truth eludes me, slipping through my fingers like sand. But one thing remains clear: the eyes that watch from the dark are real as the madness that now claims me. The advertisement seemed innocent enough. Babysitter needed for weekend evenings, one child, age 7, good pay. Desperate for the extra cash, I didn't think twice before dialing the number. The voice on the other end was weary yet kind, a mother named Elaine who sounded like she hadn't slept in years. She explained her son, Toby, was well-behaved but had been having trouble sleeping due to his vivid imagination. The first night at their secluded, somewhat decrepit house on the outskirts of town passed without incident. Toby was a quiet, introspective child with sad eyes and a smile that seemed too mature for his age. When I asked him what he liked to do for fun, he whispered, "I play with Simon." "Who's Simon?" I asked, assuming Simon was a neighbor or a school friend I hadn't been told about. Toby pointed to an empty corner of the room and said, "He's right there. He doesn't like it when you don't say hi." A chill ran down my spine, but I forced a smile and waved to the empty space. "Nice to meet you, Simon." As the weekend evening stretched on, Toby's interactions with Simon grew more intense. He would giggle at thin air, whisper secrets to the wall, and sometimes stare into space with an expression of sheer terror. Whenever I asked about Simon, Toby would say, "Simon doesn't like grown-ups. He says they ruin the fun." One evening, the air in the house turned cold, so cold I could see my breath. Toby was drawing at the kitchen table, a furrow of concentration on his brow. Curious, I peered over his shoulder to see what he was drawing. It was a picture of two figures, one small and one disturbingly large, with elongated limbs and eyes that were just empty black circles. The larger figure was holding the hand of the smaller one, leading it away from a house that looked eerily similar to this one. "Is that Simon?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Toby nodded. "Simon wants me to go with him. He says there's a place where kids can play forever, where no one tells you it's time for bed." A sense of dread settled over me. I wanted to leave, to take Toby and run from this madness, but where would we go? His mother wouldn't be back until late. I decided to call her, to tell her something was wrong, but the phone lines were dead. As night fell, Toby became agitated, his eyes darting to the dark corners of the room. "Simon's mad," he whispered. "He says you shouldn't have tried to call Mommy." The lights flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, its dim light a feeble defense against the shadows that seemed to close in on us. Toby was crying now, his sobs cutting through the silence. "He's here," Toby whimpered. The temperature dropped further, my breath forming clouds in the beam of my phone light. Then, a voice, deep and guttural, spoke from the darkness, "Leave." I grabbed Toby, my heart pounding as we raced for the door, but it wouldn't budge, sealed shut by some unseen force. Toby screamed, a sound of pure terror, and pointed behind me. I turned, phone light trembling in my hand, and there, in the corner of the room, a shadow detached itself from the darkness. It was tall, too tall, its limbs stretching and bending in ways that defied nature. Its face, if it could be called that, was a void, but I felt its gaze upon me, a pressure that threatened to crush my soul. I did the only thing I could think of. I recited the Lord's Prayer, the words tumbling from my lips in a frantic whisper. The shadow recoiled, its form flickering, and in that moment, the front door flew open, a gust of wind clearing the house of the oppressive cold. We ran into the night, Toby's hand gripped tightly in mine, and didn't stop until we reached the safety of a neighbor's house. I told them everything, my words a disjointed mess of fear and disbelief. They called the police, but when they searched the house, they found nothing. No sign of Simon, no evidence of the supernatural horror that had unfolded. Toby never spoke of Simon again, and his mother moved them out of the house soon after. But the experience haunted me, a reminder of the darkness that lurks just beyond the veil of our understanding. I stopped babysitting after that, the joy I once found in caring for children, overshadowed by the memory of that night. The realization that some horrors are all too real and not all imaginary friends are figments of childish imagination is a lesson I learned in the most terrifying way imaginable. The 20th anniversary reunion of Crestwood High was supposed to be a night of nostalgic reminiscences, a celebration of the decades that had passed since we last walked its halls. The invitation, an elegant piece of card with gold lettering, had found its way to each of us, pulling us back from the far corners of our lives to the small town we had once called home. As I entered the old gymnasium, now adorned with balloons and banners proclaiming Class of 2000, the familiar faces of my youth greeted me, each one a mirror reflecting the passage of time. Laughter and music filled the air, a veneer of joy that did little to mask the undercurrent of unease that threaded through the room. It wasn't long before the conversation turned to that night, the event that had become a whispered legend in Crestwood. The night of our senior prom, when Sarah, a girl in our class, had vanished without a trace. Her disappearance had cast a shadow over our final days of high school, a mystery that had never been solved, her fate a question mark that lingered in the back of our minds. As the night wore on and the drinks flowed more freely, the atmosphere grew charged, the weight of old memories pressing down on us. That's when Mike, once the class jock, now a man worn by years of hard living, stood up, his voice cutting through the din. "I know what happened to Sarah," he slurred, his eyes wild. A hush fell over the crowd, every conversation ceasing as all eyes turned to him. We were all there, all of us, but no one ever talked about it. It's time the truth came out. The room erupted into chaos, voices raised in denial and accusation. But Mike pressed on, his words a torrent that tore through the fragile facade of the reunion. He spoke of a party after the prom, in the woods by the old Miller place, a gathering that had spiraled out of control. Sarah had been there, he claimed, and so had we all. His story painted a picture of a night gone terribly wrong, of decisions made in the heat of the moment that had ended in tragedy. According to Mike, in a drunken stupor, an argument had erupted, and Sarah had run off into the night, chased by shadows and taunts. The next morning, when sobriety had brought the weight of guilt and fear, a pact had been made. No one would speak of the party or of Sarah's disappearance. The secret had been buried, a collective amnesia that had lasted 2 decades. The revelation shattered the reunion, old friendships fracturing under the strain of the truth. As accusations flew and denials rang hollow, the police arrived, summoned by an anonymous call. They had been reopening the case, they said, and Mike's confession had given them the final piece they needed. The investigation that followed unraveled the tightly wound threads of our lives. Evidence emerged, pieced together from the night Sarah had disappeared. The woods were searched, and there, in a shallow grave hidden beneath years of fallen leaves, they found what remained of her. The truth, when it came out, was more horrifying than any of us could have imagined. It wasn't just one person's actions that had led to Sarah's death, but a culmination of choices made by many, a tragedy born from the cruelty and recklessness of youth. The reunion ended in disarray, the gymnasium emptying as old friends turned their backs on one another, the bonds of the past irrevocably broken. And as for me, I left Crestwood once more, carrying the weight of a guilt that would never leave me, a reminder of the night when everything changed. Sarah's disappearance had been a dark cloud over our lives, but the truth of what happened that night was a storm that destroyed everything in its path. The reunion had been meant to recapture the innocence of our youth, but instead, it had forced us to confront the darkness we had all played a part in creating, a darkness that had claimed one of our own. And in the end, the class of 2000 would be remembered not for our achievements or successes, but for the secret we had kept, a testament to the fact that some memories are better left buried, and some truths are too dark to be brought into the light. The discovery of the hidden attic in the old house I had recently purchased was unexpected. Tucked away behind a forgotten panel in the ceiling of the upstairs hallway, it revealed a space untouched by time, filled with relics of a bygone era. Among the dust-covered furniture and boxes of yellowed photographs, there was an old swing, its ropes frayed, hanging from the rafters. It was an odd sight, haunting in the stillness of the attic. I spent days cleaning and exploring my new find, intrigued by the history it contained. It was during one of these evenings, as the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows stretched across the floors, that I first heard it, the soft creak of the swing moving back and forth. Chalking it up to a draft I had yet to find, I continued my work until the night had enveloped the house in darkness. It was then I decided to head back downstairs, but as I turned to leave, I froze. There on the swing was a child, a little girl, no more than 5, her feet barely scraping the floor as she moved slowly back and forth. My heart raced at the impossibility of the scene before me. The house had been empty for years before I moved in, and the panel to the attic had been sealed. Yet here she was, a child of shadows, her eyes reflecting the moonlight that filtered through the small, dusty window. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The swing stopped, and the child turned to look at me, her expression one of curiosity and sadness. "Can you help me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the silence of the attic. Frozen in place, I could only nod, unsure of how to respond. "I can't find my way back," she continued, her eyes never leaving mine. "Back where?" I managed to ask, though a part of me feared the answer. "To my room," she replied, pointing to a corner of the attic that was shrouded in shadows. I was playing, and now I can't find the door. I followed her gaze, straining my eyes in the dim light, but saw nothing. When I looked back, the swing was empty, the child gone as if she had never been there. Sleep eluded me that night, the image of the child on the swing haunting my thoughts. The next day, driven by a need to understand, I scoured the attic for any sign of the girl, any clue that could explain her presence. It was then I found it, hidden beneath layers of dust and decay, a small hand-carved door in the wall, so well blended into the surroundings that it was almost invisible. With a deep sense of dread, I opened the door to find a tiny room, its walls adorned with faded wallpaper of playful kittens. In the center, a small bed, its covers neatly arranged, as if waiting for its occupant to return. On the nightstand, a photograph of a family, mother, father, and their daughter, the child from the swing, her smile frozen in time. I learned their story through whispers in the town, a tale of tragedy that had befallen the family who once lived in my house. A fire, one winter night, had claimed the lives of the parents, their daughter never found among the ruins. It was said she had vanished without a trace, her fate a mystery that had remained unsolved. The realization hit me then, a chill that seeped into my bones. The child I had seen was a ghost, a remnant of the past, trapped within the walls of the attic, forever searching for the family she had lost. I tried to find her again, night after night, hoping to offer her some solace, a way to move on. But she never reappeared, her presence in the attic fading like the last rays of sunset. And so the house remains, its secrets hidden in the shadows of the attic, where a swing moves silently on its own, and a small room waits for an occupant who will never return. The child of the attic, lost in time, her whispers a lament for a life cut short, her presence a reminder of the tragedy that the old house harbors within its walls. The night was oppressively still, the kind of quiet that presses down on you, thick and tangible. I awoke suddenly, heart pounding, a sense of unease coiling in my stomach. The digital clock on my nightstand glowed 3:07 a.m., its red digits the only light in the pitch-black room. That's when I heard it, a soft, persistent scratching coming from the other side of my bedroom door. At first, I thought I was imagining it, the remnants of a nightmare clinging to the edges of reality. But as my senses sharpened, the scratching grew louder, more deliberate. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it simply a branch from the old oak tree outside, caressed by the wind against the door? But no, this sound was too rhythmic, too intentional for that. Frozen beneath my sheets, I debated my next move. Curiosity battled with fear, the former gradually winning as the scratching continued, unrelenting. Mustering my courage, I slid out of bed, the floor cold against my bare feet. I approached the door slowly, each step an echo in the silent house. The scratching stopped abruptly as I neared, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like a warning. Heart in my throat, I reached for the doorknob, hesitated, and then flung the door open. Nothing. The hallway was empty, bathed in the soft silver glow of moonlight that filtered through a window at the end. The scratching had ceased, but the sense of unease remained, a whisper in my mind urging me to close the door and forget this ever happened. I might have done just that, if not for the faint, almost imperceptible sound that followed the silence, a soft, sorrowful sigh, barely more than a breath, coming from the darkness of the hallway. It was a sound of longing, of lost whispers and forgotten memories. Sleep became an impossibility. The night stretched on, a taut string ready to snap. I lay in bed, listening, but the scratching did not return. Only when the first light of dawn began to seep through the curtains did I finally drift into a restless slumber, the events of the night already fading into the fog of dreams. The following night, I awoke again at 3:07 a.m. to the sound of scratching on my bedroom door. This time, it was louder, more urgent. A cold dread settled over me as I realized this was no dream, no fleeting nightmare. Something was outside my door, something that wanted in. The days blurred into a pattern of fear and sleepless nights. The scratching became a nightly occurrence, each time stopping the moment I opened the door to an empty hallway. I began to dread the approach of night, the inevitable sound of claws against wood. Desperate for answers, I installed a camera in the hallway, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever haunted my nights. But the footage revealed nothing. Each night, the same empty hallway, the scratching sounds conspicuously absent from the audio. It was then that I discovered the truth, hidden within the pages of old property records and yellowed newspaper clippings. The house had a history, a dark stain that had been carefully omitted from the real estate agent's cheerful description. Years ago, it had been the site of a tragedy, a family found dead, their bodies marked by deep, ragged scratches, as if clawed by some beast. The case had remained unsolved, the house eventually forgotten, left to hold its breath and its secrets. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The scratching, the sighs, they were echoes of the past, imprints left by a horror that had soaked into the very bones of the house. I was not alone. I was living in the aftermath of something terrible, something that lingered in the spaces between the walls, beneath the floorboards, forever scratching at the doors. On the final night, the scratching grew frantic, a desperate clawing that seemed to shake the door on its hinges. And when I opened it, expecting to find the hallway bathed in moonlight, there was only darkness, a void that reached out and pulled me into its depths. The house on the edge of town stands empty now, its windows dark, its doors locked. But sometimes in the dead of night, passers-by report the sound of scratching, a soft sighing in the wind as if the house itself is mourning. And in the darkness, behind closed doors, the scratching continues, a reminder of the horror that once walked its halls, waiting for the next inhabitant to heed its call. The night was a tapestry of shadows and rain, the streets slick and glistening under the sporadic glow of streetlights. I had stayed too late at the office, the weight of deadlines rendering time a secondary thought, until darkness had swallowed the city whole. The downpour had started suddenly, a deluge that turned roads into rivers and people into hunched figures darting for cover. Standing on the curb, I realized my chances of catching a bus home were slim. The streets nearly deserted, save for the occasional vehicle splashing through the puddles. That's when I saw the taxi, emerging from the rain like a specter, its headlights cutting through the night. Relief washed over me as I stepped forward, my hand raised. The taxi stopped with a hiss of wet brakes, its door swinging open to invite me into the warm, dimly lit interior. The driver was a silhouette against the faint glow of the dashboard, his features obscured, his greeting a gruff mumble I barely caught over the sound of the rain. I gave him my address, and we set off, the city blurring past the windows, distorted by the rivulets of water streaming down the glass. As we drove, a sense of unease began to unfurl within me. The route the driver was taking seemed unfamiliar, a labyrinth of narrow, winding streets that veered further from the direction of my home. I leaned forward, my voice tinged with concern. "Are you sure this is the right way? It seems like we're going in circles." The driver's response was a non-committal grunt, his focus unyielding from the road ahead. I tried to convince myself that my disorientation was a product of the storm, that the driver knew shortcuts I was unaware of, anything to quell the growing sense of dread. The minutes stretched into an eternity, the only sound the relentless drumming of the rain and the steady hum of the engine. The deeper we drove into the unknown parts of the city, the more the realization dawned on me. I was utterly lost, at the mercy of a stranger whose intentions were unclear. Panic clawed at my throat, my earlier relief at finding a ride home now a distant memory. "Stop the car," I demanded, my voice stronger than I felt. "I'll get out here." The driver didn't acknowledge my request. Instead, the taxi sped up, hurtling through the deserted streets with a recklessness that stole my breath away. I reached for the door, only to find it locked, the windows sealed shut, trapping me within. The taxi's interior became a prison, the rain a maddened spectator to my plight. I shouted, pounded on the windows, but the storm swallowed my cries, leaving me unheard, unseen by the world outside. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the taxi came to a stop. Not at my home, but in a part of the city so remote, so abandoned, it seemed to exist outside of time itself. The driver turned to me then, his face finally emerging from the shadows. Not a man, but something else entirely. A creature of darkness, its eyes hollow pits of despair, its smile a promise of nightmares yet to unfold. I realized then the truth of my situation. This was no ordinary taxi, no mere detour from a stormy night. It was a passage to somewhere else, a journey from which there was no return. The door opened, not to the city I knew, but to a realm of shadows and silence, a place where the rain never ceased and the lost wandered without hope. The creature spoke, its voice the sound of the grave. "Welcome home," it said, a decree rather than a greeting. I stepped out of the taxi, not because I wanted to, but because I had no choice. The door closed behind me with the finality of a tomb sealing shut. The taxi vanished, leaving me alone in the darkness, the rain an eternal companion to my new existence. Back in the city, life continued, unaware of the taxi that prowled the streets on rainy nights, searching for passengers eager to escape the storm, only to find themselves lost in the darkness, far from home. The sensation of cold, damp stone against my cheek was the first thing I became aware of, followed by a pervasive darkness that seemed to press down on me from all sides. I tried to lift my head, an action that sent waves of dizziness and disorientation crashing through me. My mind was a blank slate, void of any memories, any sense of who I was or how I came to be in this place. The air was thick with the scent of mold and decay, a smell that seemed all too familiar, yet I couldn't place why. I forced myself to sit up, my hands groping in the dark until they found the rough texture of a wall. Using it as support, I managed to stand, though my legs felt weak, barely able to support my weight. I called out, my voice echoing back at me, a stark reminder of my isolation. No names came to mind, no faces or places, just an overwhelming sense of loss and confusion. How long had I been here, and where was here exactly? Gradually, as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I made out the shape of a door. It was old, the wood swollen from moisture, with a heavy iron latch that was cold to the touch. I lifted it, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and hope, and pushed the door open. A narrow corridor stretched out before me, lit by the faint, eerie glow of torches set into the walls. The air was cooler here, carrying a draft that spoke of vast, open spaces beyond. Driven by an instinctive need to escape, to find answers, I followed the corridor, my footsteps silent on the stone floor. The passage led to a larger chamber, its walls lined with shelves filled with books and strange artifacts that seemed to hum with an unseen energy. In the center of the room stood a table, upon which lay a series of photographs. I approached, drawn by a flicker of recognition, a hope that something here might trigger a memory. The photographs were old, their edges curled and yellowed with age. They depicted scenes of a life I felt I should know, a family, a home, moments of happiness and sorrow. But the faces were strangers to me, their smiles a puzzle I couldn't solve. As I delved deeper into the chamber, I found a mirror. Its surface was dusty, the silver backing tarnished, but it offered the first glimpse of myself since waking. The reflection that stared back was unfamiliar, a face without a past, eyes that held a question with no answer. The sound of a door creaking open behind me broke the silence, a sound that filled me with an instinctive dread. I turned, expecting to confront my captor, to finally face the architect of my imprisonment. But the chamber was empty, the sense of another presence a trick of my frayed nerves. Or so I thought, until the whispers began. They were soft at first, a mere murmur in the shadows, but they grew in intensity, a chorus of voices that seemed to rise from the very walls. They spoke of secrets, of a truth too terrible to bear, of a past erased by design. I fled, the whispers chasing me, driving me back the way I had come. But the corridor had changed, the once straight passage now a maze of twisting turns that led me deeper into the darkness. The voices grew louder, more insistent, until they drowned out all other sounds, their words a litany of horrors that I couldn't escape. They spoke of a ritual, of a sacrifice made to forget, to erase the memories of a deed so dark it had blackened my soul. In the end, the truth was revealed in a flash of clarity that cut through the fog of amnesia. I had not stumbled upon this place by accident. I had sought it out, driven by a need to forget, to cleanse myself of the guilt that weighed me down. The ritual had been my choice, a pact made with shadows to trade my memories for oblivion. But oblivion came at a price. The darkness I had sought to escape was within me, a part of me that could not be erased. The voices were my own, a reminder of the person I had once been, a person I no longer knew. And so, I wandered the corridors of my prison, lost and alone, a ghost haunted by whispers of a past I could never reclaim. The darkness had claimed me, a willing victim of my own making, trapped in a cycle of forgetfulness and horror, forever searching for a way out that didn't exist. From the day we moved into the old Victorian house at the edge of town, the small circular window in the attic fascinated me. It was an odd feature, unlike any other window in the house, with thick, leaded glass that distorted the world outside into a swirl of colors and shapes. The previous owners had left it draped with a heavy curtain, as if to hide it from view, or perhaps to keep something from looking in. I was drawn to the attic, compelled by a curiosity that overshadowed the unease it evoked. The room was filled with remnants of the past, dust-covered furniture, and boxes of forgotten memories, but it was the window that captured my attention every time. It felt alive, its colors shifting with the light, a silent observer to the passage of time. One night, driven by an inexplicable urge, I climbed the narrow staircase to the attic, the house quiet around me. The moon was full, casting a silver light that seemed to illuminate the window from within, its colors more vibrant than I had ever seen. I pulled the curtain aside, my breath catching in my throat as I looked out. The world outside the window was not the one I knew. Gone were the familiar sights of our backyard and the woods beyond. Instead, there was a landscape that seemed to belong to another world, a valley bathed in moonlight, surrounded by dark, towering mountains. In the distance, I could see a city, its spires reaching toward the sky, a place of beauty and mystery that beckoned me. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the glass, the surface cold and smooth under my touch. That's when I heard it, a soft, melodic humming coming from the other side of the window. The sound was enchanting, weaving a spell that urged me closer, to open the window and step into the world it revealed. The rational part of my mind screamed for me to step back, to let the curtain fall and return to the safety of the familiar. But the humming grew louder, more insistent, and before I knew what I was doing, I had unlatched the window and pushed it open. A rush of cold air greeted me, carrying the scent of unknown flowers and the promise of secrets waiting to be discovered. The humming was clearer now, a voice calling my name, guiding me forward. I climbed onto the windowsill, the world outside pulling me in, and with a final glance back at the attic I had known, I stepped through the window. The fall was like flying, the air around me alive with light and sound. I landed softly on the grass, the city in the distance now aglow with lights of colors I had never seen. The voice called to me again, leading me toward the city, its melody wrapping around me like a warm embrace. As I walked, the beauty of the landscape began to reveal its true nature. The flowers that lined the path were not flowers at all, but faces, twisted in agony, their whispers of warning lost in the humming that filled my ears. The mountains were not made of stone, but of bones, piled high and watching with hollow eyes. I tried to turn back to find the window that had brought me here, but it was gone. The path behind me swallowed by the darkness that crept along the edges of this world. The city was closer now, its spires not of architectural marvel, but of twisted metal and screams, a monument to despair. The voice was no longer melodic, but a cacophony of voices, each one crying out in pain, in fear. I realized then that I was not a guest in this world, but a prisoner, lured by the window that was not a window at all, but a portal to a place of darkness, designed to trap the unwary. I wandered the valley, the city forever out of reach, the voices my only company in the endless night. The window in the attic, my gateway to this place of horror, remained a memory, a glimpse of the world I had left behind, forever out of reach. And in the attic of the old Victorian house, the window stands open, the curtain fluttering in the breeze, waiting for the next soul to be drawn to its light, to step through into the darkness beyond. The night was restless, charged with a silent, oppressive energy that seemed to seep in through the walls of my room. It was during these early hours of unease that I first saw her, the woman in white. She stood in my backyard, her dress ghostly against the dark backdrop of the garden, her long black hair cascading down her shoulders in waves of shadow. But it was her smile that captured me, an eerie, unchanging grin that seemed both inviting and terrifying. I blinked, thinking my sleep-deprived mind was playing tricks on me, but when I looked again, she was still there, her gaze fixed on my bedroom window, on me. I felt exposed, as if she could see into the very depths of my soul with those piercing, dark eyes. Days passed, and every night she returned, always standing in the same spot, always staring, always smiling that unsettling smile. I tried to ignore her, to convince myself she was a figment of my imagination, but the sight of her became a haunting obsession. My sleep suffered, plagued by nightmares of her standing over my bed, her smile growing wider, more grotesque with each passing night. Driven by a mix of fear and desperate curiosity, I decided to confront her. One night, as her silhouette materialized in the garden, I mustered all my courage and stepped outside. The air was cold, a chill that seemed to emanate from her very being. As I approached, her smile widened, as if pleased by my decision to face her. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, drowned out by the pounding of my heart. She didn't respond, merely tilting her head slightly, her smile never wavering. The closer I got, the more I could see the unnatural pallor of her skin, the way the moonlight seemed to pass through her, casting no shadow on the ground where she stood. I reached out, a part of me still believing I could touch her, could prove to myself she was real. But as my hand neared her form, a sudden force knocked me back, sending me sprawling on the ground. I looked up, and for a moment, her smile seemed to falter. her eyes filled with a sorrow so profound it stole my breath away. Then she vanished, leaving me alone in the darkness, the cold of the night seeping into my bones. I returned to my house, shaken, the echo of her presence a weight on my soul. The following nights were quiet, the woman in white no longer appearing in my backyard. I should have felt relieved, yet her absence left me with an inexplicable sense of loss, a longing for answers I feared I would never find. It was a week later when I awoke to a tapping at my window. Heart racing, I pulled back the curtain, and there she was, her face pressed against the glass, her eerie smile wider than ever. But this time, she was not alone. Shadows danced behind her, forms of children with empty eyes, their hands pressed against the window, seeking entry. I stumbled back, horror coursing through me as I realized her intentions. She was not merely a watcher, she was a harbinger, collecting souls with her inescapable gaze, her smile a lure for the unsuspecting. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. I wanted to run, to escape, but my body wouldn't obey. As I watched, paralyzed, the glass began to frost over, her breath a mist that obscured her face, save for her smile, which remained clear, unwavering. And then the window shattered, the cold and the darkness pouring in, along with the woman in white and the lost children she had gathered. Her smile was the last thing I saw before the shadows enveloped me, pulling me into their embrace, into a world of endless night. My disappearance was noted, but never explained. My room remained untouched, a shrine to the unspoken terror that had claimed me. And in the backyard, where she first appeared, nothing grows anymore, the ground barren, as if poisoned by her presence. The woman in white still wanders, her smile a beacon for those lost in the darkness, her collection ever growing. And behind the windows of the house at the edge of town, shadows move, a silent testament to the souls she has claimed. The day I moved into my new apartment, nestled within the heart of the city, marked the beginning of a chapter I had eagerly anticipated. The building, though aged and worn by the passage of countless seasons, held a certain charm with its intricate stonework and tall, arched windows. However, it was not long before the quaint allure of my new residence began to unravel, revealing a sinister undercurrent that flowed beneath its surface. From my very first night, the flickering lights in the staircase became a source of unease. At first, I dismissed it as a mere electrical fault, a common enough occurrence in buildings as old as this one. But as the days turned into weeks, the flickering grew more pronounced, more erratic, as if responding to an unseen stimulus. I mentioned it in passing to my neighbors, expecting confirmation of my suspicions regarding the building's aging infrastructure. Instead, I was met with averted gazes and hurried excuses, a reaction that piqued my curiosity and unease in equal measure. It was Mrs. Callaghan, the elderly lady living in the apartment below mine, who eventually offered an explanation, her voice barely above a whisper. "Pay it no mind," she said, her eyes darting to the staircase as if expecting to see something there. "Best to ignore it, to ignore them." Her words, though cryptic, sent a chill down my spine, the implication of her statement igniting a flicker of fear within my heart. But human nature, with its innate desire to uncover the truth, propelled me to investigate further, to unravel the mystery of the flickering lights. My opportunity came on a night shrouded in a thick fog that seemed to swallow the city whole. The lights began their erratic dance as I ascended the staircase, casting long, distorted shadows against the walls. Compelled by a force I could not explain, I stopped, my gaze fixed on the pattern of light and darkness that played out before me. It was then that I saw it, or rather them. Figures, barely discernible in the flickering light, their forms shifting and changing with each burst of illumination. They were trapped, it seemed, within the very fabric of the building, their movements a silent plea for recognition, for release. Frozen in place, I watched as one of the figures approached, its features becoming clearer with each step. A woman, her expression one of profound sorrow, her mouth moving as if to speak, though no sound emerged. Behind her, the others watched, their eyes hollow, their hands reaching out to me. Panic took hold, a primal urge to flee from the entities that inhabited the staircase, from the truth that lay hidden within the flickering lights. I turned to run, but my movement seemed to trigger a reaction, the lights stabilizing for a brief moment, casting the staircase in a harsh, unyielding glow. In that illumination, the history of the building revealed itself to me in a series of rapid, disjointed images, a history marked by tragedy, by lives cut short within these very walls. The figures were the remnants of those tragedies, bound to the staircase, a liminal space between their world and mine. I stumbled into my apartment, my mind reeling from the revelations, the door slamming shut behind me with a finality that seemed to echo in the suddenly oppressive silence. The flickering lights continued, a constant reminder of the presence of the others, of the sorrow that permeated the very stones of the building. Nights became a torment, the fear of the staircase and its inhabitants a weight that pressed down on me, suffocating in its intensity. I sought to leave, to escape the building and its dark history, but it was as if the apartment had claimed me, as much a prisoner as those trapped in the flickering lights. And so, I remain, a witness to the sorrow that lingers in the staircase. The flickering lights a beacon for the lost and the damned. The building stands as a monument to the unseen, to the stories that unfold in the shadows, where the past is never truly gone, and the lights flicker in a ceaseless dance of darkness and despair. The night was thick with fog, the kind that swallows sound and sight, making the familiar roads near my home feel foreign and treacherous. Rain pelted the windshield, the wipers working furiously to clear my view, though it seemed a futile effort against the relentless downpour. It was on this bleak night, as I navigated the winding roads back to my house, that I saw him, a child, no more than 10, standing by the roadside, his figure barely discernible through the mist. He was alone, drenched by the rain, his clothes clinging to his small frame. My heart twisted at the sight. What was a child doing out here, in the middle of nowhere, on such a night? Driven by a mixture of concern and disbelief, I pulled over, rolling down my window a crack. "Are you all right? Do you need help?" I called out, my voice barely carrying over the storm. The child approached, his steps hesitant. "I'm lost," he said, his voice a whisper against the howl of the wind. "Can you take me home?" There was something unsettling about his eyes, a depth that seemed too mature for his age, a sorrow that no child should bear. But the urge to help, to do something, anything, to get him out of the storm overrode my apprehension. I unlocked the doors, and he climbed into the passenger seat, his presence filling the car with a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "Where do you live?" I asked, my eyes on the road as I pulled away from the curb. He gave me directions, his voice steady, guiding me deeper into the countryside, away from the main road and into areas I was unfamiliar with. The fog seemed to thicken with each turn, the world outside reduced to a blur of shadows and muted light. Finally, he told me to stop. We were in front of an old house, its structure barely visible through the mist, the silhouette ominous against the night sky. "This is my home," he said, his tone devoid of the relief I expected. I glanced at the house, a sense of unease crawling up my spine. "Do you want me to walk you to the door?" I offered, though everything in me screamed to drive away, to leave this place and its eerie atmosphere behind. He shook his head, a small smile playing on his lips that didn't quite reach his eyes. "No, thank you. I'll be fine now." He opened the car door, stepping out into the rain, and before I could say another word, he vanished into the fog, as if he had never been there at all. The drive home was a blur, my mind racing to make sense of what had happened. By the time I reached my house, a sense of dread had settled in the pit of my stomach, a feeling I couldn't shake. The next day, driven by a need for answers, I returned to the house, the daylight doing little to dispel its sense of abandonment. The building was clearly old, neglected, the garden overgrown and wild. My curiosity turned to horror when a neighbor, seeing my car, came over to inquire about my business there. I asked about the child, describing him as best I could, the fear and the sorrow in his eyes. The neighbor's face went pale, her voice trembling as she told me the story of the house and its last inhabitants. A family that had perished in a fire many years ago, a tragedy that had claimed the lives of everyone inside, including a young boy who resembled the child I described. I was speechless, my mind reeling from the revelation. The child I had picked up, the child I had thought to bring home, had been dead for years, a spirit bound to the place of his untimely demise. The realization was a cold, sharp claw that gripped my heart, a terror that transcended the fog and the rain of that night. Since then, the fog and the rain bring a paralyzing fear, a reminder of the child by the roadside and the home that was no longer a home but a tomb. I avoid the roads near that house, but sometimes, in the depth of night, I can still hear his voice on the wind, a whisper among the raindrops, calling out for someone to take him home. And I wonder if he's still out there, waiting by the roadside, a lost soul in the fog, forever seeking passage to a place he can never return. From the moment I moved into the attic room of the old Victorian house on the outskirts of town, the whispers began. At first, I thought it was just the wind, as it often howled through the gables and eaves, creating eerie sounds. But soon I realized that the whispers weren't just random noise. They were voices, soft and insistent, speaking words that I could almost, but not quite, understand. As the days passed, the whispers grew louder and more persistent. They followed me throughout the house, a constant murmur in the back of my mind. I tried to ignore them, to drown them out with music and television, but they pierced through every barrier, demanding to be heard. The house itself was a peculiar place, full of shadows and corners that seemed to shift when you looked at them directly. I spent hours researching its history, hoping to find an explanation for the whispers. What I discovered was a tapestry of tragedy. The original owner, a reclusive widow, had been rumored to practice the occult, seeking to contact the dead. After her mysterious death, the house had passed through many hands, each owner plagued by strange occurrences and misfortunes. Armed with this knowledge, I delved deeper into the widow's life, unearthing her old journals in the hidden compartment of a dusty library nook. The pages were filled with frantic scribbles about voices from beyond, spirits she claimed to have unleashed through her rituals. Her writings became increasingly paranoid, filled with fear of something she referred to only as the Whisperers. Encouraged by the journals, I attempted to contact these spirits myself, to quell the incessant whispering. One stormy night, I set up a makeshift seance in the attic, the epicenter of the eerie sounds. Candles flickered as shadows danced across the walls, and I called out to the spirits, asking them to reveal themselves. The air grew thick, the candles snuffed out by an unseen force, plunging the room into darkness. Then a new voice joined the chorus of whispers, a voice clear and commanding, unlike the others. It called my name, over and over, a mantra that seemed to seep into my very soul. "Join us," it whispered, a demand rather than a request. "Join us, and never be alone again." Terrified yet transfixed, I felt my will eroding under the weight of that voice. The other whispers grew into a cacophony of agreement, their tones menacing now, no longer merely a background noise, but a dominant, overpowering force. In a moment of clarity, I tried to end the seance, to banish the spirits I had so foolishly summoned. But it was too late. The whispers knew my name, knew my fears, and they used them to break down my defenses. The last thing I remember was a feeling of falling, of being swallowed by the darkness as the whispers turned into screams. When I awoke, I was no longer in my attic, no longer alone. I was part of the shadows, part of the house itself. Now, I am one with the whisperers, my voice joined with theirs in an endless chorus. We wait in the darkness, speaking to those who dwell in the house, drawing them into our fold. And the house continues to whisper, to call to those who are sensitive to its murmurings, promising them solace, promising them understanding, only to envelop them in the darkness that now claims me. The whispers never stop. They are a part of the house, a part of me, and I am lost within them, forever a voice in the chorus, endlessly repeating the fate I once tried to escape. Working late nights had become a badge of honor at Anderson and Fletcher, a way to demonstrate dedication in the hopes of securing one of the rare promotions. The towering skyscraper that housed our firm seemed like a beast in slumber by the time night crept over the cityscape, its halls echoing with the solitary footsteps of those few who, like me, burned the midnight oil. I remember the night distinctly. It was the tail end of November, and a tempest raged outside, sheets of rain battering the glass facade. At around 11 p.m., I decided to call it a day. The office was deathly quiet, save for the howling wind that occasionally whistled through the slight cracks of the windows. As I packed up, I heard the distant ding of the elevator. This was not unusual in itself, as there were other weary souls trapped in their corporate climb. But the sound repeated, a gentle ding followed by the whoosh of doors sliding open and then closing with a soft thud. Over and over. I peered out from my office, down the long, empty corridor lit by the harsh fluorescence that never went off. The pattern continued, unbroken, the elevator arriving at our floor, then leaving, only to return moments later. Curiosity overcame fatigue, and I walked towards the elevator lobby. The indicator above the door flashed erratically between numbers that didn't make sense. 15, 3, 22, 1, then settling on our floor, 17. The doors opened with a sigh, revealing the vacant interior lit by sterile light. Hesitant yet compelled, I stepped inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, the air chilled, my breath turning to mist. I shivered, pressing the button for the ground floor, but instead of descending, the elevator ascended. I mashed the buttons frantically, but it was futile. The elevator was under its own command. It stopped at the 22nd floor, the executive level, a sprawling expanse of plush carpets and art that none below senior management ever visited. The doors opened, and I stepped out into a cold so biting it felt personal. The floor was deserted, the storm outside muffling any sound other than the beating of my own heart. I wandered, looking for a phone or some explanation. When I heard it, the soft murmur of voices discussing deals and figures, the buzz of a day's work. But it was past midnight. Confused, I followed the sounds to the boardroom, the door slightly ajar. Peering inside, I saw them, the executives, as clear as day, engaged in a meeting. Only something was off. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, as if I was watching a scene played by marionettes. Their eyes, when they flicked towards the door where I hid, were hollow. No life gleamed back at me, just the dull sheen of glassy stares. Panic gripped me, icy and sharp. I stumbled back, my gaze catching something that hadn't been there before. The portraits of past executives, usually hanging in the main lobby, lined the hallway. But in each frame, instead of the benign smiles of industry giants, were scenes of each individual distorted in expressions of terror and despair. I sprinted back to the elevator, slamming the button to descend. The doors took their time closing, the murmur from the boardroom growing louder, angrier. The elevator began its descent, finally obeying my frantic commands, but as it moved, it shuddered violently, lights flickering, as if passing through layers of a cold, invisible storm. When the doors opened again, I was in the lobby. Relief washed over me in an almost painful wave. I rushed out into the tempest outside, rain washing over me, grounding me in reality. I didn't look back as I made my way home. From that night on, I refused to work late, fearful of what controlled the elevator after dark. I learned from hushed conversations and the tight-lipped janitorial staff that the 22nd floor was off-limits after hours, supposedly for cleaning. But whispers among my colleagues spoke of figures seen roaming the floor, trapped in an endless loop of work, their souls claimed by the very enterprise to which they had dedicated their lives. As for the elevator, it continues its nocturnal journeys. New employees are advised casually by the more experienced not to linger late. Bad for health, they say with a knowing look. But every company has its secrets. Ours just happens to reside between the rising floors of an elevator that moves to its own sinister rhythm. I woke up to the cold sting of the steering wheel beneath my fingertips, my head pounding with a relentless ache that gnawed at my temples. The first wisps of dawn were threading through the trees, casting eerie shadows across the dashboard of my car. Confusion wrapped around me like a thick fog. I had no memory of how I'd ended up here, parked in the depths of the forest that bordered our town. My heart skipped as I noticed the blood. It was splattered across the passenger seat, dark and coagulated, a stark contrast to the beige upholstery. More disturbingly, it was on my hands, dried and cracked as if it had been there for hours. Panic surged through me, ice cold and sharp. I frantically searched my body for injuries, but found none. The blood wasn't mine. I tried to think back to the previous night, to piece together the fragmented shadows of memories that danced just out of reach, but nothing made sense. The last thing I remembered was sitting at the bar with friends, laughing and drinking. How had the night turned so sinister? My phone was dead, its battery life depleted, no doubt from trying to reach someone, though I had no recollection of making a call. I felt utterly isolated, the silence of the forest pressing in on me with oppressive weight. With trembling hands, I started the car, the engine sputtering to life with a reluctant groan. I needed to get back to town, to find help, to understand what had transpired. As I drove through the winding forest roads, the reality of my situation began to sink in. There was blood in my car, blood on my hands, and no memory of the night before. Fear twisted into paranoia. What if I had done something terrible? The thought was a specter that haunted every turn. Arriving back in town felt like emerging from a different world. I headed straight to the police station, my mind a turmoil of dread and confusion. I told them everything, my voice a mix of confusion and fear, the officers exchanging glances that did nothing to ease my anxiety. They took me back to the station, running tests, asking questions that I couldn't answer. Hours passed in a blur of white rooms and stern faces until they finally told me they had found a body in the forest, not far from where I had been parked. A local man, known around town, last seen at the same bar I had been at. The room spun around me, the walls closing in as they explained that they needed to keep me for further questioning. The evidence, they said, was circumstantial but troubling. My mind raced, panic clawing its way up my throat. How could I defend myself when I had no memory of what might have happened? Days turned into weeks, and the gaps in my memory refused to fill. The town turned against me, whispers and stares following me wherever I went. The trial came. The evidence laid out in sterile detail, but without a memory, I had no defense that could outpace the suspicions. I was convicted, the gavel's fall echoing like a death knell. As they led me away, the last piece of the night came back to me in a flash. A glimpse of another, a face twisted in rage, not my own in a struggle. But it was too late. The truth, fragmented and elusive, remained just out of reach, buried deep within a night I could no longer fully grasp. Now, I sit in a cell, the bars as cold and unforgiving as the memory of that night. Outside, life moves on, but I remain trapped, haunted by the blood in my car and the gaps in my memory. The forest whispers on windy nights, a mocking reminder of the freedom I once had, and the mystery of that night, forever unsolved, hangs over me like a specter, a dark cloud from which there is no escape. It began as a whisper of unease, a cold touch down my spine when the power blinked out, plunging my small apartment into darkness. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a prelude to the storm that was inching its way towards us, its hunger palpable in the electrically charged air. My phone, a lone beacon in the consuming black, flickered its last gasp of life before the screen dimmed to nothing. I was left alone, enveloped by the kind of darkness that presses against your eyes and fills your ears with the sound of your own heartbeat. In the eerie silence that followed, a sound emerged from the hallway outside my bedroom. It was a dragging, shuffling noise, as though something heavy were being pulled across the floor. My breath hitched, the hairs on my arms rising as the sound grew nearer, stopping just outside my bedroom door. There was no logical explanation for someone to be there. My apartment was on the top floor, and I had bolted the door. Panic, sharp and biting, clawed at my throat. With trembling hands, I pushed myself off the bed and crept towards my closet, the only place I could think to hide. The closet door creaked as I slipped inside, pulling it closed just enough to peer through the crack. My heart pounded a frantic beat, threatening to burst from my chest as I waited, listened. The shuffling resumed, now inside my room. I could hear the soft, uneven breaths of something inhuman, a sickening, guttural sound that filled the space between the wooden slats of the closet door. The presence moved around my room, the occasional thump making my breath catch in fear. It was searching for something, or someone. Minutes stretched into an eternity, each second a slice of terror. The storm outside escalated, wind howling like the wails of the damned, drowning out all other sounds. Suddenly the noise ceased, and a heavy silence fell, a silence more terrifying than any sound. My eyes, adjusted to the dark, could make out a sliver of light as the bedroom door creaked open wider, a new draft stirring the stagnant air. The thing had left, or so I hoped, retreating back to wherever it had come from. I waited, counting to 100, then 2, before daring to believe I might be safe. Finally, I emerged from the closet, my limbs stiff from fear and crouching. The apartment was still dark, the storm outside muffling all sounds of normalcy. My relief was palpable, a living thing inside my chest. I moved towards the bedroom door, intent on making a break for the front door and the outside world. But as I passed by the foot of my bed, a cold hand shot out, grabbing my ankle with a grip of iron. I screamed, my voice lost in the roar of the storm, as I was pulled down, dragged under the bed. There, in the claustrophobic darkness, eyes gleamed back at me, pale, lifeless eyes filled with hunger. The last thing I saw before those hands pulled me further into the darkness was the rest of the room, illuminated briefly by lightning, revealing nothing amiss, the closet door still slightly ajar, as if waiting for the next person to hide, to wait, to hope. And outside, the world remained oblivious, the storm masking any sounds of struggle, the night eventually giving way to dawn, bringing light to an empty apartment. The storm passed, the silence complete. My disappearance, like the sounds in the hallway, remained unexplained, a dark whisper in the light of day. I woke to the stinging cold, a pervasive chill that seemed to seep into my very bones. My eyes opened to darkness, thick and complete, the kind that presses against you, suffocating and impenetrable. I tried to move, my limbs stiff and uncooperative, as if they too had succumbed to the cold that enveloped me. I was on a hard, uneven floor, the wood rough beneath my fingertips. A musty, earthy smell filled the air, the scent of decay and neglect. As my eyes adjusted, faint outlines began to emerge in the darkness. A table, a few scattered chairs, and an old fireplace that was little more than a black hole in the wall. Where was I? The last thing I remembered was driving through the mountains, the storm raging around me, the road a treacherous path that wound through the night. Had I found this place, seeking refuge from the storm? Or had someone brought me here, to this abandoned cabin that seemed forgotten by time? I pushed myself up, my head spinning with a vertigo that gripped me fiercely. I needed to find a light, a window, anything that would tell me more about where I was. My hands searched the walls, fingers tracing the rough wood until they brushed against something cold, metallic, a flashlight. With a flick, a weak beam of light pierced the darkness, revealing more of the cabin's interior. It was devoid of life, untouched except for a layer of dust and cobwebs that spoke of years of disuse. The windows were boarded up, no light from the outside world penetrating the thick wood that sealed them shut. Driven by a need to escape, to find my way back to something familiar, I moved towards the door, the flashlight's beam unsteady in my trembling hands. But as I reached for the handle, a sound stopped me cold, a low, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor, coming from above. My heart raced, terror clawing at my throat. I was not alone. I shone the flashlight towards the ceiling, the wooden beams groaning under the weight of whatever moved above. The sound grew louder, more desperate, a cacophony of thuds and scratches that seemed to close in on me. I backed away from the door, the beam of the flashlight flickering, threatening to plunge me back into darkness. I needed to hide, to find a place to protect myself from whatever horror lurked in the shadows of the old cabin. My light fell on the fireplace, the realization dawning on me, the chimney. It was a potential way out, a narrow, vertical escape from this nightmare. With no time to spare, I climbed into the cold, sooty darkness, pulling myself up, the walls rough against my hands. As I ascended, the noises from the cabin grew fainter, but they were quickly replaced by another sound, whispers. They echoed down the chimney, voices so faint I thought I might have imagined them. But they grew louder, more insistent, speaking in tongues I couldn't understand. They seemed to come from all around me, from the very bricks that enclosed me. Panic set in, a frantic, clawing terror as I realized the chimney was not an escape, but a passage, a descent into something far worse than the cabin below. The whispers turned to screams, the darkness to a palpable force that enveloped me, suffocating, crushing. I reached for the top, the open sky my only hope, but it never came. The chimney grew tighter, the walls closing in, the screams so loud now they were all I could hear. And then, the light from my flashlight flickered one last time, and I was swallowed by the darkness, my screams joining the chorus of whispers in the chimney, another soul trapped in the endless night of the old cabin. The cabin remains there, hidden among the trees, its chimney a gaping mouth that whispers in the wind, calling to those lost and desperate enough to seek refuge within its walls. And I remain too, a part of its darkness, a whisper in the night, forever climbing, forever falling, never escaping. In the quaint and usually serene town of Eldridge, nestled between the looming mountains and dense whispering forests, an unsettling pattern had begun to emerge. Every few weeks, a townsperson would vanish, leaving behind empty homes and unanswered questions. The local police were baffled, their investigations leading only to dead ends and growing fear among the residents. Amidst this chaos lived Mary Ann, a widow known throughout Eldridge for her culinary prowess and the comforting dinners she hosted every Sunday. Her meals were a town staple, a weekly tradition that seemed to defy the creeping dread that had begun to envelop Eldridge. Despite the disappearances, her dinners went on, her guests praising her for her resilience and the seemingly magical quality of her food that made their worries vanish, if only for a few hours. Mary Ann lived alone in her old, weathered house at the edge of town, near the dense forest. Her husband had passed away years ago, and they had no children. Her life was her kitchen, her guests, her family. Every Sunday, without fail, she would open her doors to neighbors, providing a feast for anyone who wished to join. Her dishes were often unusual, exotic meats and savory stews that she claimed were old family recipes passed down through generations. As the disappearances continued, a heavy fog of paranoia began to descend upon Eldridge. Trust frayed, and once friendly faces now seemed suspicious. Yet, every Sunday, like clockwork, the remaining townsfolk would find themselves drawn to Mary Ann's table, the aroma of her cooking a brief balm to their fears. One particularly chilly evening, as the town grappled with the disappearance of young Samuel, the baker's apprentice who had vanished just days before, Mary Ann prepared for her dinner with an unusual zeal. The table was set more lavishly than usual, the dishes covered with ornate lids that hid their contents from eager eyes. As the guests gathered, whispering anxiously among themselves about the latest disappearance, Mary Ann unveiled each dish with a flourish. The main course was a rich, hearty stew, its scent so intoxicating that all other concerns seemed to momentarily fade away. "It's a special recipe," Mary Ann declared with a mysterious smile, "one that requires very particular ingredients that are hard to come by." The townsfolk devoured the meal with gusto, remarking that they had never tasted anything so delicious. As the dinner drew to a close and the guests began to feel a warmth spreading through their bodies, a sense of drowsy contentment enveloping them, Mary Ann retired to the kitchen, her work done. The next morning, Eldridge awoke to an eerie silence. Mary Ann's guests had not returned home. Concern turned quickly to horror as the police finally decided to search Mary Ann's house, something that no one had dared to propose before, given her status in the community. In her cellar, they found the unspeakable. Rows of jars filled with preserved meats labeled with dates and names, the names of the missing townspeople. The cellar was a meticulous record of horrors, each jar a grim chapter in a culinary diary of madness. Mary Ann was nowhere to be found, having disappeared into the woods, her secrets laid bare. The town of Eldridge never recovered. The remaining residents moved away, leaving it a ghost town. Mary Ann's house still stands, a monument to the macabre. The dinners she hosted, now a chilling memory of how dangerously close the community had come to a predator in their midst. And somewhere in the forest that blankets the mountains, it's said that sometimes, if the wind is just right, you can still catch the faintest scent of cooking. a reminder that Marianne might still be out there, preparing her next meal. The allure of the vast, serene lake was irresistible to any avid fisherman, which is why I convinced my longtime friend, Alex, to join me for a weekend fishing trip. It was the perfect escape from our grinding city lives, offering not only the thrill of the catch, but also the tranquil beauty of nature. Our destination, Lake Merrow, was particularly renowned for its abundant bass and remote, untouched charm. We arrived late Friday evening, the sun just dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. The lake, encircled by dense woods and rugged terrain, appeared eerily still, the surface mirroring the twilight sky so perfectly it seemed we were peering into another world. Eager to make the most of our weekend, we set up camp quickly and prepared our gear. Our first night passed peacefully, the only sounds being the occasional splash of fish and the distant calls of nocturnal animals. We shared stories by the fire, the flames casting ghostly shadows that danced between the trees. It was the perfect start to what we expected to be a memorable trip. However, as dawn broke, a thick fog rolled over the lake, so dense we could barely see the water from our campsite. Undeterred, we launched our small boat into the obscured waters, the fog swallowing us whole. We joked about the lake's mythical creature, Old Marrow, a monstrous fish said to lurk in the depths as we cast our lines into the unseen waters below. Hours passed with little to show for our efforts, the fog a persistent veil that refused to lift. Our light-hearted banter slowly died away, an uneasy silence taking its place. It was then that I felt a powerful tug on my line, stronger than any fish I'd ever hooked. Excitement surged through me as I struggled with the reel, Alex assisting eagerly. The struggle was immense, the creature beneath the murky waters, fighting with a strength that was almost inhuman. Our boat rocked dangerously, water sloshing over the sides. Alex, his face a mask of concentration and thrill, suddenly froze, his gaze locked on something in the water. I followed his look, my heart skipping a beat. Beneath the surface, illuminated by a brief parting of the fog, was not the body of a fish, but the pale, bloated face of a human, eyes hollow, staring up at us. A scream caught in my throat, but before I could react, the face disappeared into the depths, pulling strongly on the line. In our shock, we failed to secure the boat, and a massive pull from below capsized it, throwing us into the chilling embrace of Lake Merrow. The water was icy, a cold that bit into the bones, stealing the breath from our lungs. I surfaced, gasping, frantically searching for Alex in the enveloping fog. A chilling laugh echoed across the water, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Alex's voice called to me, distant and distorted, filled with terror. I swam towards it, my limbs numb, my mind racing with panic. But I was too late. When I reached him, he was motionless, his body suspended in the water, eyes wide with an expression of utter horror. Something had wrapped around his ankle, something that was not rope, not fish, but cold and slimy. I tried to pull him free, but the lake pulled back, dragging him down into the dark waters. I watched, helpless, as the love of my friend disappeared beneath the surface, the lake claiming him with a hungry greed. The laughter continued, a mocking, horrendous sound that seemed to come from the lake itself. Exhausted, terrified, and alone, I managed to swim back to shore, collapsing on the muddy bank. The fog eventually lifted, but the scars of that day never faded. I never went back to Lake Merrow, and the police never found Alex's body. The lake kept him, just another lost soul swallowed by its depths. Now, when the fog rolls in, they say you can hear laughter over Lake Merrow, a reminder of the depths that hold secrets not meant to be discovered. And sometimes, just sometimes, a voice calls out, begging for help that will never come. The day I discovered the secret tunnel in the basement of my new house, the skies had been overcast, a curtain of gray that seemed to press against the windows with silent, watchful eyes. I had been moving boxes into the spacious but dimly lit basement when my foot caught on something beneath the old worn rug I had planned to discard. Curious, I pulled it back, revealing a small wooden trapdoor, its existence a secret held tightly by the aged floorboards until now. With a mixture of excitement and apprehension, I lifted the trapdoor, revealing a narrow staircase that spiraled down into darkness. Fetching a flashlight, I descended, the air growing cooler with each step, the smell of damp earth and something faintly metallic filling my lungs. At the bottom, I discovered a tunnel, the walls constructed of old brick, arched like the spine of some great slumbering beast. It stretched out before me, the end swallowed by an impenetrable blackness that my flashlight seemed unable to pierce. Driven by an insatiable curiosity, I ventured forward, my footsteps echoing off the cold stone, a staccato beat that seemed to pulse with anxious life. The further I walked, the more the atmosphere changed. The air felt charged, heavy, as if soaked with the whispers of the past. My light flickered across ancient markings etched into the bricks, symbols that made my skin crawl, their meanings unknown but clearly ominous. The tunnel eventually opened into a larger chamber. In the center, surrounded by an array of old candles, was a stone altar. Its surface was stained with dark, dried rivulets that I could only assume were blood, long since dried to a sickly brown hue. The sight sent a chill through me, the implications of what this place had been used for weaving dark threads of dread deep within my heart. As I approached the altar, the air grew suffocatingly tight, as if the chamber itself was constricting around me. That's when I heard it, a soft, whispering voice, so faint I thought I might have imagined it. "Free us," it pleaded, a chorus of whispers echoing the initial plea, multiplying around me in the stagnant air. Panicked, I turned to leave, but the way I had come was no longer there. The tunnel had vanished, replaced by more brick wall, as if it had never existed. Trapped, I faced the altar again, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. "Free us, join us," they chorused, a maddening mantra that filled the chamber. Desperate, I searched for another way out, my hands trembling as I pushed against the cold stone walls. It was then that I noticed the floor around the altar seemed disturbed, loose dirt scattered as if recently moved. Driven by a terror-fueled frenzy, I began to dig with my hands, throwing aside clumps of damp earth. What I uncovered was horrifying. A mass grave, skeletal remains tangled together, their empty eye sockets seeming to stare up at me, their bony fingers reaching out as if in accusation or invitation. The whispers turned into howls, the darkness around me undulating as if alive. I tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the vast emptiness of the chamber. As I stumbled back, the bones began to move, animated by some unholy force, assembling into grotesque forms of their former selves. They advanced, their movements jerky, unnatural. I was surrounded, the dead enclosing me, their whispers now screams in the claustrophobic air. The last thing I remember was falling backward onto the altar, the candles igniting as if by their own accord, casting eerie shadows over the advancing figures. The chamber grew impossibly cold, the darkness complete, and I realized with horror that I would not leave this place. Now, I am part of the whispers, another voice in the chorus, another soul bound to the darkness of the chamber beneath the house. We wait together, bound by our fate, whispering for release, or perhaps for company, in the eternal black beneath the old worn rug in the basement.